The dawn broke cold over the Sicilian coast, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and dying gold. Don Vittorio Santangelo walked alone along the shore, his black coat billowing behind him like the wings of a crow. The old man moved with deliberate slowness, each step a meditation on loss and power, on the empire he had built and the price he had paid for it. He had walked this beach every morning for 30 years. It was his ritual, his penance, his only moment of solitude in a life consumed by the demands of the familia. The waves whispered secrets to him, speaking in a language older than blood oaths and vendetta. Here, with the salt wind stinging his weathered face, he could almost forget the weight of the crown he wore. But this morning was different. Something dark rested on the sand ahead, half submerged in the retreating tide. At first, Vittorio thought it was driftwood, another piece of debris the sea had vomited onto his shore. But as he drew closer, his heart began to beat with a rhythm he had not felt in decades. It was a coffin, a wooden coffin, aged and salt-stained, covered in barnacles and strands of seaweed that hung from it, like mourning veils. The Don stopped. His hand moved instinctively to his chest, where beneath his shirt hung the only photograph he had kept from his youth. For a long moment, he simply stood there, listening to the gulls cry overhead and the waves crash behind him. Something ancient and terrible stirred in his gut, a premonition that made even a man who had ordered 100 deaths feel the cold touch of fate. He approached the coffin slowly, his shoes sinking into the wet sand. The wood was dark, almost black, carved with symbols he recognized from the old country. This was not some sailor's hasty burial at sea. This coffin had been made with care, with intention. Someone had wanted it to be found. Vittorio knelt beside it, his knees protesting the movement. His hands, scarred and powerful despite his age, traced the edges of the lid. There was no lock, only wooden pegs swollen with seawater. He began to work them loose, one by one, his breath coming faster with each moment. His bodyguards would arrive soon for their morning check. They could not see him like this. They could not see the Don on his knees, prying open a coffin like a common grave robber. The first peg came loose, then the second, the third. His hands were shaking now, something that had not happened since the night he took his father's place as head of the famiglia. The night he became more symbol than man, more legend than flesh. The lid resisted for a moment, then gave way with a groan of tortured wood. Vittorio lifted it, the muscles in his arms burning with the effort. The morning light spilled into the coffin's interior, illuminating what lay within. And Don Vittorio Santangelo, the man who had never shown weakness, who had watched men die without flinching, who had built an empire on blood and silence, fell backward onto the sand and wept. She was there. Isabella. His Isabella. She looked exactly as she had 30 years ago, as if time had forgotten her, as if death itself had been too awed by her beauty to corrupt it. Her dark hair was still lustrous, spread around her head like a halo of midnight. Her skin was pale as moonlight, perfect and unblemished. She wore the white dress, the one she had worn the last time he saw her. The night before, everything changed forever. Her hands were folded across her chest, and between her fingers, yellowed with age but still intact, was an envelope. His name was written on it in her handwriting, that elegant script he had once memorized from love letters she would slip to him in the marketplace. Vittorio reached for the envelope with trembling hands. His vision blurred with tears he had not shed since he was a boy. The morning sun climbed higher, indifferent to the old man's anguish, indifferent to the way his shoulders shook with sobs that came from a place deeper than his lungs, deeper than his heart. How was she here? How was this possible? The questions crashed through his mind like the waves against the shore, but he could not speak them aloud. His voice had abandoned him, fled in the face of this impossible resurrection. He pulled the envelope free from her grip, her fingers stiff and cold against his. Inside was a letter, written in the same elegant hand. But Vittorio could not read it yet. Not here, not now. He looked at Isabella's face, memorizing it again, trying to reconcile the girl he had loved with this perfect, terrible ghost the sea had returned to him. He remembered the last time he saw her alive. They had met in secret at the old olive grove beyond the village, where the trees grew so thick that not even the moon could penetrate their shadows. She had been crying, begging him not to do what his father demanded. "Do not kill my father," she had pleaded. "Find another way. There is always another way." But there had been no other way. Not in their world. Not when the old Don gave an order, and certainly not when that order was a test of loyalty. Isabella's father, Marco Marino, had been skimming from the Familia's operations, feeding information to rivals in Palermo. The insult could not stand. The betrayal demanded blood. Vittorio had tried to explain this to her, had held her face in his hands and spoken the truth that would destroy them both. "I have no choice. If I do not do this, my father will give the task to another, and then he will know I am weak. He will know that I put love before the Familia, and then we will both die." She had pushed him away, her eyes blazing with fury and heartbreak. "Then you are already dead to me, Vittorio Santangelo. You are already a ghost." He had killed her father 3 days later. One bullet to the back of the head in Marco Marino's own kitchen, while the man sat eating his evening meal. Clean, professional, without mercy. And when it was done, when Vittorio had proven himself worthy, his own father had embraced him and named him heir to the Santangelo empire. But Isabella had vanished. He had searched for her, quietly, desperately. He had sent men to every corner of Sicily, to the mainland, to the places where a young woman might flee to escape the shadow of the Familia, but she had disappeared as completely as if the earth had swallowed her whole. For weeks, he had lived in agony, torn between his new responsibilities and the gnawing fear that she had done something terrible in her grief. Then the months passed, and the years, and Vittorio had learned to live with the hole in his chest where his heart had been. He had married, as the Familia required, a woman from a respected bloodline who gave him no children and asked no questions. She had died 10 years ago, and he had mourned her properly, but he had never loved her. He had buried that capacity the night Isabella vanished. Now here she was, returned to him by the sea, still wearing the white dress, still beautiful, still impossible. Vittorio became aware of voices in the distance. His men were approaching, their morning rounds bringing them down to the beach. He had perhaps 2 minutes before they arrived. 2 minutes to decide what to do with this miracle, this curse, this gift the ocean had laid at his feet. He stood, his body protesting the movement, and looked down at Isabella's peaceful face one last time. Then, with a strength born of decades commanding men and bending the world to his will, he lifted her from the coffin. She was light, so light, as if death had hollowed her out and left only the shell. He cradled her against his chest, the white dress stark against his black coat, and began walking back toward his villa. The bodyguards appeared at the top of the dune, their hands moving toward their weapons before they recognized their Don. They froze, confusion and shock playing across their faces as they watched the old man approach with a dead woman in his arms. Salvatore, his most trusted soldier, was the first to speak. "Don Santangelo, what is this? Who is she?" Vittorio's voice, when it came, was rough with emotion but carried the weight of absolute authority. "No one speaks of this. You saw nothing this morning." "Nothing." "Am I understood?" The men nodded quickly, their faces pale. They had served the Don long enough to know when not to ask questions, when silence was the only acceptable response. Vittorio continued past them, his pace steady despite the burden he carried. "Take care of the coffin. Burn it. Scatter the ashes in the sea and find Father Tommaso. Tell him I require his presence immediately. Tell him to bring what he needs for a blessing. He is to speak to no one about this summons." "Yes, Don Santangelo," Salvatore replied, his voice barely above a whisper. The old man carried Isabella through the grounds of his estate, past the gardens where lemon trees grew in neat rows, past the fountain where stone angels wept eternal tears, through the heavy oak doors of his villa. The house staff scattered before him like frightened birds, their eyes wide with questions they dared not voice. He brought her to his private chambers, a suite of rooms. No one but he was allowed to enter. The bed was still unmade from the restless sleep he had abandoned before dawn. He laid Isabella upon it gently, arranging her dress so that it fell around her in elegant folds, positioning her hands once more across her chest. Then he sat in the chair beside the bed, the envelope still clutched in his hand, and he allowed himself to truly look at her in the morning light that filtered through the curtains. She had not aged a day. That was impossible, of course. People aged even in death. Bodies decayed, returned to dust, were consumed by time and nature, and the inevitable progression of entropy. But Isabella looked as she had at 23, frozen in the moment before life had torn them apart. Vittorio's hands shook as he opened the envelope. The paper inside was thick, expensive, the kind used for important documents. The ink had faded slightly but was still legible. He began to read, and with each word, the foundations of his world shifted and crumbled. "My dearest Vittorio," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then the sea has kept its promise and brought me back to you. I pray that it is not too late, that your heart still remembers mine, even after all these years and all the silence that has stood between us. I did not abandon you. I want you to know that first before anything else. I did not leave because I hated you, though I hated what you did. I did not flee because I could not bear the sight of you, though the sight of you now brings me both joy and agony in equal measure. I was taken, my love. 3 days after my father's death, while I was preparing to leave Sicily to escape the memory of blood and betrayal, men came for me in the night. They wore masks, but I knew them by their voices, by the way they moved. They were Santangelo men. Your men, Vittorio. They brought me to a place I would come to know too well, a convent on the Calabrian coast, far from Sicily, far from anyone who might recognize me or carry word of my fate. But this was no holy sanctuary. It was a prison, a place where the Famiglia sent women who knew too much, who had seen too much, who needed to disappear without the mess of murder. The Mother Superior who ruled that place was no servant of God. She served your father, the old Don, and later she served you. Though I do not believe you ever knew of her existence or the purpose she fulfilled. They told me why I had been taken. I was pregnant, Vittorio, carrying your child, our child. I had discovered this the day before my father died, and in my grief and confusion, I had confided in my aunt, thinking she would help me. But she was the one who betrayed me. She sent word to your father that Marco Marino's daughter carried the heir's bastard, and that I planned to leave Sicily and raise the child far from the Famiglia's reach. Your father could not allow that. An heir born outside his control, outside the bloodlines he had so carefully maintained, was a threat to everything he had built. So he ordered my disappearance. Not my death. Not at first, because he needed to know if I truly carried his grandchild. And when the months proved the truth of it, when my body swelled with the life we had created together, he made his decision. The child would be taken from me at birth and given to a loyal family to raise, one that would never speak of the infant's true origins. And I would remain in the convent for the rest of my days, a ghost, a cautionary tale whispered among those who thought to challenge the Familia's will. I gave birth to our son on a winter night, when the wind howled like the damned. They let me hold him for only a moment before they tore him from my arms. He had your eyes, Vittorio. Even in that brief glimpse, I saw you looking back at me from that tiny, perfect face. They told me he had died, that he was too weak, too small, that he had not survived the night. But I knew they lied. I heard him crying as they carried him away. I heard his voice in my dreams for years afterward, calling for a mother who could not answer. Vittorio's hands were shaking so violently now that he had to set the letter down on his lap. A son. He had a son, or had once had a son, before his father's cruelty had stolen that too. The rage that filled him was cold and absolute, a fury that made his visions swim with red. But his father was 20 years in the grave. There was no revenge to be taken there, no satisfaction to be found in cursing a dead man's memory. Vittorio forced himself to breathe, to calm the storm in his chest, to continue reading. I lived in that place for 30 years, my love. 30 years of grey walls and silent prayers and the constant ache of loss. I aged, though not as I should have. Perhaps it was the grief that kept me young, or perhaps it was the hope I clung to despite all reason. Hope that somehow, someday, the truth would reach you. Hope that you would come for me, that you would tear down those walls and carry me home. But you never came. How could you? You did not know. And as the years passed, I came to understand that I could not blame you for my captivity. You had been manipulated as much as I had, used as a pawn in your father's endless games of control. 2 months ago, I finally found my chance to escape. The old Mother Superior died, and in the chaos of her passing, I managed to slip away. By then, I was already dying, Vittorio. The sickness had been growing in me for years, eating away at my lungs, my bones, my strength. I knew I had little time left. I made my way back towards Sicily, driven by the desperate need to see you one last time, to tell you the truth before death claimed me. But I did not make it far. My body betrayed me, just as everything else had betrayed us. In my final days in a small village on the coast, I met an old fisherman who listened to my story with tears in his eyes. He had lost his own love to the sea many years before, and he understood the poetry of what I asked him to do. I gave him the last of my money and made him promise. When I died, he would place me in a coffin, dress me in the white gown I had kept hidden all these years, the one I wore the last night we were together. He would seal the coffin and set it adrift in the current that flows toward Sicily, toward your shore. And he would pray that the sea would be kinder than men had been, that it would carry me home to you. I do not know if this will work. I do not know if you will ever find me, or if I will simply drift forever in the darkness beneath the waves. But I had to try. I had to believe that love, even love as broken and betrayed as ours, deserved one final chance. If you are reading this, then I am home at last. I am with you again, even if it is only my shell, only the memory of what I was. And I can rest, knowing that you know the truth. That you understand I never stopped loving you, never stopped being yours even when an ocean of years stood between us. Find our son, Vittorio. He is 30 years old now, a man grown, living his life unaware of who his true parents are. I do not know where they took him, but I know your father kept records of everything. The truth is, somewhere in the secrets he left behind. Find it. Find him. Give him the life we should have given him together. And forgive me, my love, for not being strong enough to survive until I could see your face one more time. Forgive me for leaving you twice, even though neither time was my choice. I will wait for you on the other side, where the famiglia's reach cannot extend, where we can finally be together without blood and duty standing between us. Forever yours, Isabella. The letter fell from Vittorio's hands and fluttered to the floor. He sat frozen in his chair, his face wet with tears, his chest heaving with sobs he could no longer contain. The morning sun climbed higher beyond the windows, painting the room in shades of gold that seemed cruel in their beauty. A son. He had a son. Somewhere in this world, a man of 30 walked and breathed and lived, carrying Santangelo blood without knowing it, his heir, his child, the future that had been stolen from him before he even knew it existed. And his father, the old Don, the man Vittorio had respected and feared and ultimately succeeded, had orchestrated it all, had looked him in the eye for 20 years, knowing what he had done, knowing the grandson he had hidden away and said nothing, had died with the secret locked behind his teeth, taking his cruelty to the grave. A knock at the door interrupted Vittorio's spiral into rage and grief. Father Tommaso's voice came through the heavy wood, tentative and concerned. "Don Santangelo, you sent for me?" Vittorio wiped his face with his hands, trying to compose himself, to rebuild the mask of strength that was his armor and his burden. "Come in, Father." The priest entered, old and bent, carrying his worn leather case of holy implements. He had been the familia's confessor for 40 years, had blessed their weddings and christened their children, and given last rites to their dying. He had seen everything, heard everything, and kept silent about all of it. But when Father Tommaso's eyes fell upon Isabella's body lying on the Don's bed, he stopped dead in his tracks. His face went white as chalk. "Holy Mother of God," he whispered. "Isabella Marino." "But that's impossible. She's been gone for 3 decades. "You knew her," Vittorio said, his voice flat and dangerous. The priest's hands shook as he set down his case. "I knew her. Yes. I heard her final confession before she disappeared. She was preparing to leave Sicily, to escape the violence and grief. She was with child, Don Santangelo. Your child. She told me everything." Vittorio rose from his chair, and despite his age, despite the weight of grief bearing down on him, He moved with the predatory grace that had made him feared throughout the underworld. You knew, and you said nothing. Father Tommaso's face crumbled. She confessed to me under the seal of the sacrament. I could not break that sacred trust. Not even for you. Not even when you became Don. The seal is absolute. Vittorio grabbed the priest by his collar, lifting him slightly off the ground despite the older man's weight. My father took her. He imprisoned her for 30 years. He stole my son from her arms and hid him away like a dirty secret. And you knew, didn't you? You knew what the old Don was capable of. You could have warned me. You could have given me some sign. The priest's eyes were wet with tears. I suspected, yes, but I had no proof. Your father was careful. He confessed nothing to me. And Isabella, by the time I learned of her fate, it was too late. I tried to find her, Don Santangelo. I swear on the cross I tried, but she had vanished as completely as if the earth had swallowed her whole. Vittorio released the priest, shoving him back. Father Tommaso stumbled but caught himself against the wall. The two men stared at each other, decades of shared history crackling between them like lightning about to strike. Then bless her, Vittorio said, his voice breaking. Give her the rights she deserves, and then you will help me find my son. The priest nodded, his face stricken with sorrow and guilt. I will, Don Santangelo. I will give you what answers I have. But first, let me do what I can for Isabella's soul. Father Tommaso approached the bed with reverent steps. He opened his case and began to prepare the holy water, the oils, the prayers for the dead. Vittorio watched from the window, his back to the room, his eyes fixed on the sea that had returned his love to him too late, always too late. Outside, the morning stretched on. The world continued to turn, indifferent to the tragedy unfolding in the Don's private chambers. But in that room, time seemed to bend and break, caught between past and present, between love and loss, between the man Vittorio had been and the man he would have to become to make this right. As Father Tommaso's Latin prayers filled the air, Vittorio made a silent vow to the woman lying still and beautiful on his bed. He would find their son. He would uncover every secret his father had buried. He would tear down every wall, break every silence, defy every rule of the famiglia if necessary. And those who had kept Isabella from him, those who had stolen 3 decades of their lives, would learn that the Don's mercy had limits, and that some betrayals could only be answered with blood. The sea had given him back his love. Now it was time to take back everything else that had been stolen. The funeral was held 3 days later in the private chapel on the Santangelo estate. Only a handful of people attended: Father Tommaso, Salvatore, and 2 other trusted soldiers, and the Don himself. The coffin was closed, sealed, draped in white silk that matched the dress Isabella wore beneath. White roses covered every surface, their perfume so thick it was almost suffocating. Vittorio stood at the front, his face carved from stone, his eyes dry. He had cried all the tears he had left in those first hours after finding her. Now there was only the cold, calculated fury that had made him one of the most powerful men in Sicily. He listened to Father Tommaso's prayers without hearing them, his mind already racing through the puzzle that lay before him. A son, 30 years old, hidden somewhere in the world, living under a false name, unaware of the blood that ran through his veins. The old Don had been meticulous in his cruelty, but he had also been meticulous in his record-keeping. Every transaction, every decision, every secret operation had been documented and locked away in the vault beneath the villa. If answers existed, they would be found there. After the service, after Isabella had been laid to rest in the family crypt, Vittorio summoned Father Tommaso to his study. The priest arrived looking haggard, as if the weight of his silence over the years had finally broken through the armor of his faith. Sit, Vittorio commanded, gesturing to the chair across from his massive oak desk. The priest obeyed, his hands folded in his lap like a schoolboy called before the headmaster. Tell me everything you know about Isabella's disappearance, Vittorio said. Every detail, every suspicion, every fragment of information that you have kept locked in your conscience for 3 decades. Father Tommaso swallowed hard. I told you the truth, Don Santangelo. She came to me in confession. Told me she was pregnant with your child. that she planned to leave Sicily and raise the baby far from the violence of the familiar. I could see she was terrified, but also determined. She loved you, even after what you had done to her father. She still loved you, and then she vanished. Yes. 2 days after our conversation, I went to check on her at her aunt's house, where she had been staying since her father's death. The aunt told me Isabella had left in the night, taken a bag of clothes and what little money she had, and disappeared. I believed it at first. It seemed consistent with what she had told me. But then, weeks passed and I heard nothing. No word from the mainland, no sightings, nothing. What changed your mind? Father Tommaso's fingers twisted together. Your father came to me about 3 months after Isabella's disappearance. He wanted me to say a private mass for the soul of a deceased infant. He would not tell me the child's name, would not tell me where the child was buried. He simply demanded the service and paid me handsomely for my discretion. At the time, I thought perhaps it was for some bastard child of one of the familiar members, a baby that had died and needed to be forgotten. But later, much later, I began to wonder. Vittorio's jaw tightened. You thought it was my son. I suspected it might be, but I had no proof, and your father was not a man one questioned without evidence. I began to investigate quietly, carefully. I spoke to the midwives in the region, asked if any had attended a difficult birth around that time. Most had nothing to tell me, but one, an old woman who has since passed, she remembered something strange. She had been summoned to a convent in Calabria to assist with a birth. The mother was young, she said, and beautiful, with dark hair and eyes that held oceans of sorrow. The girl had given birth to a healthy boy, but the Mother Superior took the child immediately and sent the midwife away with a purse full of gold and a warning never to speak of what she had seen. Vittorio leaned forward. Did she tell you which convent? Santa Maria della Pietà, on the cliffs overlooking the sea near Tropea. It is a fortress of a place, run by an order that has always had, shall we say, flexible interpretations of their vows. They have served the interests of powerful families for generations. Your father had connections there. His own sister had been sent there as a girl when she shamed the family with an inappropriate love affair. Why did you not tell me this before? The priest's voice broke. Because I was a coward, Don Santangelo, because I feared your father's wrath, and later I feared what the truth would do to you. You had become Don by then. You had responsibilities, a wife, the weight of the entire familia on your shoulders. I told myself that knowing would only cause you pain, that the past was better left buried. I told myself many things to justify my silence, but I was wrong. I was a coward, and I failed both you and Isabella. Vittorio stood and walked to the window. Outside, the sun was setting over the Mediterranean, painting the water in shades of blood and gold. Somewhere out there, beyond the horizon, his son lived and breathed and went about his life, ignorant of his true heritage. Santa Maria della Pietà, Vittorio repeated. You will write down everything you know about this place, the names of the nuns who served there 30 years ago, the families that supported it, every connection you can remember, and you will pray, Father, that some of them are still alive and willing to talk. Yes, Don Santangelo, and Father, if I discover that you have withheld anything else from me, anything at all, I will forget that you are a man of God. Do you understand? The priest nodded, his face ashen. I understand, then go. I have work to do. After Father Tommaso left, Vittorio stood alone in his study for a long time, staring at the portrait of his father that hung above the fireplace. The old Don looked back at him, with that same expression of iron certainty he had worn in life. The absolute conviction that he was always right, that his decisions were beyond question. Vittorio had loved his father once, had worshipped him even. As a boy, he had followed the old Don everywhere, hanging on his every word, desperate to prove himself worthy of carrying the Santangelo name. He had killed for his father, lied for him, sacrificed his own happiness for the sake of the familia his father had built. And all the while, the old Don had been destroying the one thing that mattered more than power, more than respect, more than the empire itself. He had stolen Vittorio's chance at a real life, at love, at fatherhood. He had sentenced Isabella to 30 years of imprisonment and grief. He had torn an infant from his mother's arms and hidden him away like some shameful secret. The rage that burned in Vittorio's chest was cold and patient, the kind of fury that did not explode, but instead calculated, planned, waited for the perfect moment to strike. His father was beyond his reach now, safe in the grave, but there were others who had helped execute the old Don's cruelty, others who had kept silent, who had known and done nothing. They would answer for it, all of them. Vittorio turned from his father's portrait and walked to the far wall of his study, where a painting of a Sicilian landscape hung in an ornate frame. He pressed the hidden mechanism, and the painting swung outward, revealing the door to the vault beyond. The Don entered his private sanctuary, a room lined with filing cabinets and ledgers, the accumulated secrets of 50 years of Santangelo operations. He knew exactly where to look. The old Don had kept a special cabinet for what he called matters of family honor, operations that were too sensitive to trust to anyone else. Vittorio had inherited the keys to this cabinet when he became Don, but he had rarely needed to access it. The Famiglia's business dealings, its conflicts with rivals, its arrangements with corrupt officials, all of these were documented elsewhere. This cabinet held only the most personal secrets, the darkest corners of the Santangelo legacy. He unlocked the drawer and began sorting through files. Most were exactly what he expected, records of illegitimate children born to Famiglia members, embarrassing incidents that had been covered up, evidence of indiscretions that could have been used as blackmail. But near the back, in a folder marked simply with the year of Isabella's disappearance, he found what he was looking for. Inside were detailed records of payments made to the convent of Santa Maria della Pietà. The amounts were substantial, monthly stipends that continued for exactly 30 years and then stopped abruptly 6 months ago. There were also records of communications with the Mother Superior, a woman named Sister Agata Russo, who had apparently reported regularly on Isabella's condition and behavior. The correspondence was chilling in its clinical detachment. The subject remains docile and compliant, one letter read. She has given up hope of rescue and has accepted her fate. Another letter, written 2 years after Isabella's imprisonment, noted, the subject attempted escape during the feast of San Giovanni. She was caught before reaching the main road and has been placed in solitary confinement as punishment. She will not attempt this again. Vittorio's hands shook as he read. His father had monitored Isabella's suffering for decades, had received regular updates on her despair, and had done nothing to end it. The old Don had been content to let her rot in that place, knowing that his son believed her to be free somewhere, living her life far from Sicily. But the most important document in the folder was a single page, dated 2 months after Isabella's disappearance. It was a bill of sale, disguised as an adoption record, transferring custody of a male infant, birth date matching the timeline of Isabella's pregnancy, to a family named Caruso. The Carusos lived in Naples, and according to the attached notes, they were loyal associates of the Famiglia who ran a successful import business. They had been childless and eager to adopt, and they had asked no questions about the baby's origins. The child had been given the name Antonio Caruso. Vittorio stared at the name for a long time, committing it to memory. Antonio. His son was named Antonio. The boy would be 30 now, no longer a child, but a man. What kind of man had he become? Did he work in the family business, running imports through the port of Naples? Did he have Isabella's eyes, her smile? Did he ever feel the pull of something missing in his life, some void he could not explain? There was more in the file. Photographs taken from a distance of a boy at various ages, 5 years old, playing in a courtyard, 10 years old, walking to school with a book bag slung over his shoulder, 15, awkward and gangly in the way of adolescence. The photos stopped when the boy turned 18, as if the old Don had finally decided that the threat had passed, that his grandson was sufficiently integrated into another family and posed no danger to the Famiglia's bloodlines. Vittorio studied the photographs, searching for traces of himself or Isabella in the young man's features. The resemblance was there, subtle but unmistakable. Antonio had Vittorio's strong jaw, his dark coloring, but also Isabella's elegant bone structure, her expressive eyes. He was handsome in a way that suggested both strength and sensitivity, a combination that would serve him well or destroy him, depending on the path his life took. The Don closed the folder and sat back in his chair. He had found his son, or at least found where to begin looking. But now came the harder question. What would he do with this knowledge? Antonio Caruso had lived his entire life believing he was someone else. He had parents who had raised him, who presumably loved him, who had given him a home and an identity. Vittorio could not simply appear in Naples and declare himself the young man's true father. That would be cruel, disruptive, possibly dangerous. The Caruso family might resist, might even go to war to protect the son they considered theirs. And Antonio himself, what would he think? Would he welcome the truth? Or would he reject it, cling to the only family he had ever known? These were questions that required careful consideration. But Vittorio knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would meet his son. He would look into Antonio's eyes and see the living proof of the love he had shared with Isabella. And he would decide then, face to face, what role he could or should play in the young man's life. But first, there were other matters to attend to. The convent, Sister Agata Russo, the familiar members who had helped the old Don carry out his plan. Vittorio needed to know exactly who had been involved in Isabella's imprisonment, who had known about Antonio's existence and kept silent. He needed names, and he needed to understand the full scope of the conspiracy. He locked the vault and returned to his study. Salvatore was waiting outside, as he always did when the Don was conducting private business. The soldier straightened when Vittorio emerged, his scarred face alert and ready. "Salvatore, I have an assignment for you," Vittorio said. "You are to travel to Calabria, to a convent called Santa Maria della Pietà near Tropea. You will go alone, and you will go quietly. I want you to learn everything you can about this place. Who runs it now? Who served there 30 years ago? What became of a nun named Sister Agata Russo? Talk to the locals, the shopkeepers, anyone who might remember. But do it carefully. I do not want anyone to know that the Santangelo familia is asking questions." Salvatore nodded. "When do you want me to leave?" "Tomorrow morning. Take money for bribes, but use it sparingly. We do not want to draw attention. And, Salvatore, if you find Sister Agata still alive, do not approach her directly. Simply report her location to me. I will handle that conversation personally." "Understood, Don Santangelo." After Salvatore departed to make his preparations, Vittorio returned to his private chambers, where Isabella's white roses were already beginning to wilt in their vases. He had not slept in this room since the morning he found her on the beach. Instead, he had taken to sleeping in the chair beside the window, his eyes fixed on the dark sea beyond, his mind turning over the puzzle of his stolen life. Tonight was no different. He sat in his chair, a glass of whiskey untouched on the table beside him, and thought about Isabella's letter. "Find our son," she had written. "Give him the life we should have given him together." But what life could he offer? Antonio was 30 years old, established in Naples, presumably with his own dreams and plans. Vittorio was 65, an old man by the standards of their world, his best years behind him. He had built an empire, yes, but it was an empire of blood and shadows, of compromises and cruelties. Was that something he wanted to pass on to his son? Was that the legacy Isabella would have wanted for the child she had held for only a moment before he was torn from her arms? The questions gnawed at him through the long night. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the salt smell of the sea and the distant sound of waves breaking against the shore. It was the same sound he had fallen asleep to as a boy, the same rhythm that had marked all the years of his life, constant, inevitable, indifferent to human suffering. As dawn approached, Vittorio made his decision. He would find Antonio and observe him first, learn what kind of man his son had become before revealing himself. He would go to Naples personally, alone, disguised as an ordinary businessman conducting ordinary affairs. He would watch his son from a distance, see how he moved through the world, what choices he made, what values he held. And then, if the moment felt right, if Antonio proved to be a man worthy of knowing the truth, Vittorio would approach him. He would tell him about Isabella, about the love that had created him, about the injustice that had stolen their chance to be a family. He would offer Antonio the choice that had been denied to all of them, the choice to accept or reject the Santangelo name, The choice to remain Antonio Caruso or become who he had been born to be. It was a risk. Everything about this was a risk. But Vittorio had not built his power by playing it safe, by cowering before uncertainty. He had taken risks all his life, had gambled everything on his ability to read situations and people, to know when to strike and when to wait. This would be no different. Except that this time, the stakes were not money or territory or power. The stakes were something far more precious and far more fragile. The stakes were the last chance to salvage something beautiful from the wreckage of the past, to honor Isabella's memory by doing right by their son. As the sun rose over the Mediterranean, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Vittorio stood and made his way down to the beach. The spot where he had found Isabella's coffin was empty now, just another stretch of sand and water, unremarkable to anyone who did not know its significance. But Vittorio knew. He would always know. This was where the sea had returned his greatest love and his deepest regret. This was where his old life had ended and a new purpose had been born. He stood there for a long time, listening to the waves, saying a silent prayer to the woman who rested now in the family crypt, the woman who had endured 3 decades of suffering and still found the strength to guide him toward redemption. "I will find him, Isabella," he whispered to the wind. "I will find our son, and I will give him the truth. And those who kept you from me, those who stole our life together, they will pay for every moment of your pain. This I swear on your memory, on our love, on everything I am and everything I have become." The waves crashed against the shore, carrying away his words, carrying them out to sea where perhaps, in some realm beyond the reach of the living, Isabella would hear them and know that even in death, even after decades of separation and loss, her love had not been forgotten. Vittorio turned from the water and walked back toward his villa. There was work to be done, a journey to plan, a son to find. The Don had wept for his lost love. Now it was time for him to act, to move with the same cold efficiency that had made him feared throughout Sicily. Sentiment had its place, but so did justice. So did revenge. So did the settling of accounts that had been decades in the making. The Famiglia had taught him that power came from control, from the ability to bend others to your will through fear and respect. But Isabella had taught him something else, something the old Don had never understood. Real power came from love, from the willingness to sacrifice everything for what mattered most. And what mattered most was not the empire, not the respect of other criminals, not the accumulation of wealth and influence. What mattered most was family. Not the Familia, with its rules and codes and endless cycles of violence, but real family, blood and bone, the ties that should have been sacred but had been violated by men too concerned with power to remember their humanity. Vittorio would remember. He would honor the bond between father and son, between a man and the woman he had loved. He would fix what the old Don had broken, or he would die trying. And if anyone stood in his way, if anyone tried to keep him from his son or tried to hide the truth about Isabella's suffering, they would learn that there were some sins even the passage of time could not erase, and some debts that could only be paid in blood. The Don returned to his study and began to plan. Naples was a city of millions, chaotic and dangerous, but also a place where the Santangelo name carried weight. He would need to be careful, methodical. He would need to prepare for every possibility. But first, he would wait for Salvatore to return from Calabria with information about the convent and the nun who had overseen Isabella's imprisonment. Then the real work would begin. Salvatore returned from Calabria 5 days later, his face grim and his eyes carrying the weight of dark knowledge. He found the Don in the garden, standing among the lemon trees that Isabella had once loved, back when she would visit the estate in secret during their stolen moments together. "Don Santangelo, I have news," Salvatore said, his voice low and respectful. Vittorio turned from the trees, his expression unreadable. "Speak. The convent is still there, though it has fallen on hard times. Most of the original sisters are dead or have been transferred to other houses. The building itself is crumbling, and the few nuns who remain are old women, forgotten by the church and the families that once supported them. And Sister Agata Russo." Salvatore's jaw tightened. "She lives, Don Santangelo. She is 83 years old, blind in one eye, her body ravaged by arthritis and time. but her mind is still sharp, according to the locals. They say she sits in her cell all day, praying for forgiveness for sins she will not name. The other sisters fear her even now. They say she speaks to ghosts at night, begging them to leave her in peace. Good, Vittorio said coldly. Then she has a conscience after all. Where is she? Still at Santa Maria della Pietà. She never left. The locals told me she tried once, about 10 years ago, tried to walk away and start a new life somewhere else. But she made it only as far as the village before she collapsed in the street, screaming that she could not escape, that the walls would follow her wherever she went. They carried her back to the convent, and she has not attempted to leave since. Vittorio nodded slowly, processing this information. And the other nuns? Did you learn which ones were there when Isabella was imprisoned? Salvatore pulled a small notebook from his pocket. 3 of them remain. Sister Caterina, who served as the convent's infirmary nurse, Sister Lucia, who managed the kitchens, and Sister Margherita, who taught the younger women needlework and prayer. All 3 are in their 70s or 80s now. I spoke to a shopkeeper in the village who supplies the convent with food. He says the sisters rarely venture out anymore, and when they do, they look like women haunted by terrible memories. They should be haunted, Vittorio said, his voice hard as stone. They helped imprison an innocent woman for 30 years. They participated in the theft of my child. Their prayers will not save them from what they deserve. What would you have me do, Don Santangelo? Nothing yet. I will go to Calabria myself. I will speak to Sister Agata and these others. I will hear from their own lips what they did, what they knew, what they chose to remain silent about. And then I will decide their fate. Salvatore hesitated, then spoke carefully. Don Santangelo, if I may offer counsel, these are nuns, women of the church. If harm comes to them, there will be questions, investigations. The church protects its own, even the guilty ones. Vittorio's eyes were cold as winter. Then let the church ask its questions. Let them investigate. They will find nothing, because I will leave nothing to find. But those women will answer for what they did, Salvatore. One way or another, they will pay their debts. The soldier nodded and retreated, knowing better than to press further when the Don's mind was set. 2 days later, Vittorio made the journey to Calabria. He traveled alone, as he had planned, driving himself in a nondescript sedan rather than the black Mercedes that announced his status. He wore simple clothes, a workman's jacket and plain trousers, and he had not shaved in several days, allowing grey stubble to shadow his jaw. To any casual observer, he was just another aging man on the road, perhaps visiting family or conducting modest business. The drive took most of the day. Vittorio followed the coastal highway south, watching the sea change color as the sun moved across the sky. He passed through small villages where old men played cards in cafes and women hung laundry on lines strung between balconies. This was the Italy tourists never saw, the quiet, dying corners of the country, where young people fled to the cities and left behind only the elderly and the stubborn. He reached Tropea in the late afternoon, the town perched on cliffs above the sea, its medieval buildings glowing gold in the slanting light. Under different circumstances, Vittorio might have found it beautiful, but today he saw only the fortress-like structure of Santa Maria della Pietà, set apart from the town proper, surrounded by high walls that spoke of secrets and suffering. He parked his car in the village and walked the last kilometre to the convent. The road was steep and narrow, lined with wild olive trees and overgrown rosemary bushes. By the time he reached the gates, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire. The gates were iron, rusted in places, and they stood slightly ajar, as if the convent no longer had the strength to keep the world out. Vittorio pushed them open and stepped into a courtyard overgrown with weeds. The fountain at its centre had long since run dry, its stone basin cracked and filled with dead leaves. A nun emerged from the main building. Ancient and bent, her habit faded to a dull grey. She stopped when she saw Vittorio, her roomy eyes widening with something that might have been fear or recognition. "We do not accept visitors without appointment," she said, her voice trembling. "Who are you? What do you want? I am here to see Sister Agata Russo," Vittorio replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. Tell her that Vittorio Santangelo has come to speak with her about Isabella Marino." The nun's face went white as chalk. She swayed on her feet, and for a moment Vittorio thought she might faint. Instead, she steadied herself against the doorframe and whispered, "Holy Mother of God, we have been waiting for you. Then you know why I am here." The nun nodded slowly. "Sister Agatha said you would come someday. She said the past could not stay buried forever, that the sea would give up its dead, and the truth would surface like bones from a shipwreck. We did not believe her. We thought her mind had finally broken. But here you are just as she prophesied. Take me to her." The nun turned and shuffled into the building, and Vittorio followed. They passed through corridors that smelled of mildew and neglect, past cells with doors hanging open to reveal narrow beds and bare walls. This place had been a prison disguised as a sanctuary, and even now, decades later, the suffering seemed to seep from the stones. They descended a staircase to a lower level, where the light grew dimmer and the air grew cold. At the end of a long hallway, the nun stopped before a heavy wooden door. She knocked twice, then pushed it open without waiting for a response. "Sister Agatha, you have a visitor," she announced, "the one you have been expecting." Vittorio stepped into the cell. It was small and spare, containing only a narrow bed, a wooden chair, and a small table with a Bible and a rosary. Sitting on the bed was an old woman who looked as if she had been carved from wax, her skin yellow and translucent, her body so thin that she seemed barely substantial enough to cast a shadow. But her eyes, one milky with blindness, and the other still sharp and dark, fixed on Vittorio with the intensity of a hawk sighting prey. "So," she said, her voice surprisingly strong for someone so physically diminished, "the Son comes at last to demand an accounting for the sins visited upon his beloved. I have been waiting for this day for 30 years, Vittorio Santangelo. I have prayed for it and dreaded it in equal measure." Vittorio closed the door behind him, shutting out the other nun. He remained standing, towering over the old woman, his presence filling the small cell with barely restrained violence. "You imprisoned Isabella Marino for 30 years. You took my son from her arms and gave him to strangers. You watched her suffer and did nothing to help her, nothing to ease her pain. Why?" Sister Agatha's laugh was bitter and dry. "Why? Because I was ordered to, of course. Because your father, the great Don Santangelo, commanded it, and I, like a fool, believed that serving his will was the same as serving God's will. I told myself I was protecting the familiar, preserving the bloodlines, maintaining the order that kept our world stable. I told myself many things to make my cruelty bearable. Did she beg you for mercy? Every day for the first 5 years. After that, she stopped begging. She stopped speaking entirely for a time. The silence was worse than the pleading, I think. It was the silence of a soul that had given up hope." Vittorio's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You could have let her go. You could have sent word to me about my son. You could have shown compassion. I could have done many things," Sister Agatha replied, her voice steady despite the tears now streaming down her wrinkled face. "But I did not. I was too afraid of your father, too committed to the lie I had built my life around. The convent had always served powerful families, had always been a place where inconvenient women disappeared. I had overseen this work for decades before Isabella arrived. She was not the first, though she was the longest held. I told myself it was necessary, that it was for the greater good. But in truth I was simply a coward who chose obedience over conscience. Tell me about my son." Sister Agatha wiped her face with a trembling hand. "He was beautiful, perfect in every way. He had your dark hair and Isabella's eyes. When he was born, he cried with such strength, such life. Isabella held him for perhaps 10 minutes before your father's men took him away. She screamed for days afterward. We had to sedate her to keep her from harming herself. Eventually the screaming stopped, but she never forgave me. She looked at me every day with eyes full of hate and sorrow, and I deserved every moment of it. Where did they take him? To Naples, to a family named Caruso, associates of your father who were childless and eager. They named him Antonio. Your father kept watch over the boy for years, had photographs taken, reports compiled. He wanted to ensure that his grandson grew up strong and loyal, even if the boy never knew his true heritage. I think the old Don intended to reveal the truth someday, to bring the boy into the familiar when he was old enough. But then your father died, and the secret died with him. Or so I thought. Vittorio sat down heavily in the wooden chair, suddenly feeling every one of his 65 years. Antonio, he repeated softly. My son's name is Antonio. Yes, he is 30 years old now. I do not know what kind of man he has become. The report stopped when he turned 18, and I have heard nothing of him since. But I have prayed for him every day, prayed that he would have a better life than his mother, that he would be spared the cruelty and suffering that marked her existence. Your prayers mean nothing, Vittorio said coldly. You cannot pray away the damage you have done. I know. Sister Agata's voice was barely a whisper now. I know my prayers are worthless. I know that I will burn in hell for what I did, but I offer them anyway because they are all I have left. When Isabella escaped and died, when her body washed up on your shore, I felt it here. She pointed to her chest. I felt her finally free, finally at rest, and I knew then that my time was coming, that you would find the truth and come for me. Vittorio stood and walked to the small window set high in the cell wall. Through it, he could see a sliver of sky turning dark with approaching night. How many others were involved? Who else knew about Isabella? The other sisters here knew she was imprisoned, but they did not know who she was or why she was being held. Only I knew the full truth. Your father dealt directly with me, sent his instructions through coded letters and trusted intermediaries. The midwife who delivered the baby knew, but she died years ago. The men who transported Isabella here knew, but they were your father's personal enforcers, dead for decades now. There is no one left to punish except me in these old walls. And the Caruso family, did they know? Sister Agata shook her head. They were told the child was an orphan, the bastard son of a Famiglia member who died in a dispute. They asked no questions because they wanted a son and knew better than to look too closely at gifts from powerful men. As far as I know, they raised Antonio as their own and never spoke to him of his origins. Vittorio turned back to face the nun. Isabella wrote me a letter before she died. She asked me to find our son, to give him the life we should have given him together. She asked me to make things right. And will you? Sister Agata's good eyes studied him intently. Will you tell Antonio the truth? Will you claim him as your heir? I do not know yet. That depends on what kind of man he has become and whether the truth would be a gift or a curse. But I will find him. I will observe him. And I will decide. That is wise, the old nun said. The truth is not always mercy. Sometimes it is the cruelest thing we can give. Silence fell between them, heavy and charged with 3 decades of suffering and regret. Finally, Vittorio spoke again, his voice low and dangerous. What should I do with you, Sister Agata? You have confessed your crimes. You have acknowledged your guilt. But confession does not erase the damage, does it? Isabella is dead because of you. 30 years of her life were stolen because you followed orders instead of your conscience. I know, the nun replied simply. I am ready to face whatever judgment you deem appropriate. I have lived too long already, carried this guilt for too many years. If you choose to end my life, I will not resist. If you choose to let me live with my memories and my prayers, I will accept that too. I am beyond fear now, Don Santangelo. Death would be a mercy compared to the hell I have lived in since the day Isabella was brought to these walls. Vittorio studied her for a long moment. He had come here expecting to feel rage, to want blood, to demand the kind of violent retribution that the Famiglia Code required. But looking at this broken old woman, hollow with guilt and ravaged by time, he felt only a deep, aching emptiness. Killing her would accomplish nothing. It would not bring Isabella back. It would not restore the years they had lost. It would not make Antonio's life any better, or heal the wounds that had been inflicted on all of them. You will live, Vittorio said finally. You will live, and you will carry your guilt, and you will pray your worthless prayers until you draw your last breath. That is your punishment, Sister Agata. Not death, not peace, but the endless weight of knowing what you did and what you failed to do. You will die here in this cell alone with your memories, and when you finally face whatever judgment awaits you in the next life, you will answer for every moment of Isabella's suffering. The nun nodded slowly. Thank you, Don Santangelo. Not for mercy, because this is not mercy, but for understanding that some punishments are worse than death. Vittorio walked to the door, then paused with his hand on the handle. One more thing. The other sisters who were here when Isabella was imprisoned, Sister Caterina, Sister Lucia, Sister Margherita, they will remain here as well. They will care for you in your final years, and you will care for each other, bound together by the shared knowledge of what you allowed to happen within these walls. That is my judgment. You will all grow old together, your sins binding you more tightly than any vows you took when you entered this order. We understand. And if I learn that any of you have spoken of Isabella or my son to anyone outside these walls, if I hear even a whisper of this story spreading beyond this place, I will return. And when I return, I will not be so merciful. The familiar's reach is long. Sister Agata, do not test it. We will be silent, Don Santangelo. We have been silent for 30 years. We can be silent until we are buried. Vittorio left the cell without another word. He walked back through the corridors of Santa Maria della Pietà, past the ancient nun who still waited in the courtyard, out through the rusted iron gates and into the cool evening air. The sun had set completely now, and stars were beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. He stood outside the walls for a long time, breathing deeply, trying to process the conversation he had just had. Part of him wanted to go back, to drag Sister Agata and the others into the courtyard and make them pay in blood for what they had done. But he knew that violence would not satisfy the hunger in his chest. It would not honor Isabella's memory or help him find his way forward. Isabella had asked him to find their son and give him a life. She had not asked him to seek revenge on every person who had wronged them. She had asked him to build something, to create rather than destroy. And for the first time in his life, Vittorio understood the difference between justice and vengeance. Justice was giving Sister Agata and her fellow nuns exactly what they deserved, a lifetime of guilt and the isolation of their own making. Vengeance would have been quick and satisfying in the moment, but ultimately hollow. He returned to his car and began the long drive back to Sicily. As he drove through the night, the sea on one side and the dark mountains on the other, he thought about Antonio, his son, a man of 30 who had lived his entire life as someone else. What would it be like to meet him? What would he say? How could he possibly explain the truth in a way that would not shatter Antonio's entire understanding of who he was? These were questions Vittorio could not answer yet, but he knew the next step. He would go to Naples. He would find Antonio Caruso. He would observe him from a distance, learn what kind of man his son had become, and then, when he understood the situation fully, when he had all the information he needed, he would make his decision. The road stretched ahead into darkness lit only by his headlights. Somewhere at the end of this journey was a young man who did not know that his entire life was built on lies, that his true father was searching for him, that his mother had spent 30 years in a prison cell, longing for him with every breath. Vittorio would find him, and when he did, everything would change. For both of them. The miles rolled by beneath his wheels, carrying him toward a future that was uncertain and terrifying and full of possibility. He thought of Isabella, resting now in the family crypt, her suffering finally over. He thought of the letter she had left him, the words that had set him on this path. "Find our son," she had written. "Give him the life we should have given him together." He would try. He would do everything in his power to honor her request. But the weight of 30 years of lies and secrets was heavy, and Vittorio was not certain that redemption was possible for a man like him. He had built his life on violence and control, on bending others to his will and showing no weakness. But for Isabella, for Antonio, for the love that had been stolen from them all, he would try to be something different. He would try to be the father his son deserved, even if it meant facing truths about himself that he had spent a lifetime avoiding. The night deepened around him as he drove on, alone with his thoughts and his plans, moving toward a future that he could not yet see but was determined to reach. Naples greeted Vittorio with chaos and noise, the city's famous energy assaulting him the moment he crossed into its boundaries. The streets were packed with cars and motorcycles weaving between pedestrians, vendors shouting about their wares, laundry strung between buildings like colorful banners, announcing the vitality of life in this ancient, crowded port. It was so different from the ordered quiet of his Sicilian estate, so far removed from the controlled world he had built around himself. He had arranged for lodging in a modest hotel near the port district, the kind of place where questions were not asked, and guests were valued for their discretion rather than their wealth. The room was small and clean, with a window overlooking a narrow street where children played soccer with a ball that had seen better days. Vittorio stood at that window for a long time, watching the ordinary rhythms of life play out below him, trying to imagine his son growing up in a city like this. The information he had gathered before leaving Sicily told him that the Caruso family ran an import business, specializing in textiles and small manufactured goods. Their office was located in the commercial district near the waterfront, a modest operation by the standards of major players, but successful enough to support a comfortable lifestyle. Vittorio had also learned that Giuseppe Caruso, the man who had raised Antonio, had died 3 years ago from a heart attack. His widow, Rosa, still lived in the family home in the Vomero district, and Antonio himself worked at the import office, managing the day-to-day operations. Vittorio's first move was to scout the import office. He dressed in the plain clothes of a merchant, nothing that would draw attention, and positioned himself at a cafe across the street, where he could observe the comings and goings. He ordered an espresso and a newspaper, settling in to watch and wait. The office was housed in a 3-story building with faded yellow paint and green shutters. A hand-painted sign above the door read, "Caruso Import and Export, established 1978. People moved in and out throughout the morning, deliverymen hauling boxes, office workers arriving with briefcases, clients coming to negotiate deals or pick up orders. And then, just before noon, he appeared. Antonio Caruso emerged from the building carrying a leather folder under one arm, his other hand holding a cigarette that he lit as he paused on the sidewalk. Vittorio's breath caught in his chest. Even from across the street, even with 30 years of life between them, he recognized his son. The resemblance was undeniable. Antonio had Vittorio's height, his build, the same strong shoulders and confident bearing. But it was Isabella who shone through in his face, in the elegant bone structure, the expressive dark eyes, the way he moved with unconscious grace. He wore a well-tailored suit, not expensive but well-maintained, and his hair was thick and dark, touched with just a hint of grey at the temples, despite his relative youth. Vittorio watched as Antonio walked down the street, stopping to greet an elderly woman who was struggling with her shopping bags. He took the bags from her without being asked, carried them to her door 2 buildings down, and refused what appeared to be an offer of payment or thanks. The simple kindness of the gesture struck Vittorio deeply. This was not the behavior of a man raised in the brutal world of the familia, where every action was calculated and kindness was weakness. Over the following days, Vittorio fell into a pattern. He would arrive at the cafe in the morning and stay until evening, watching his son through all the small moments that made up a life. He saw Antonio negotiate with difficult clients, maintaining patience and professionalism even when tested. He saw him share lunch with his employees, laughing at their jokes, asking about their families. He saw him stay late to help load a truck when they were short-staffed, not standing apart as the boss, but working alongside his people. On the 4th day of surveillance, Vittorio followed Antonio after work. His son stopped at a market to buy fresh vegetables and a bottle of wine, then drove to a modest apartment building in a middle-class neighborhood. Vittorio parked down the street and watched as Antonio climbed the stairs to a second-floor apartment. Through the window, he could see his son moving around the kitchen, preparing dinner for one. There was no wife, Vittorio had learned. Antonio had been engaged once several years ago, but the relationship had ended badly. The woman had wanted him to move to Rome, to leave Naples and his mother and the family business behind. Antonio had refused, and she had left him for someone with greater ambitions. According to the information Vittorio had gathered, Antonio had not seriously dated anyone since. On the 5th day, Vittorio learned something that changed his understanding of his son completely. He followed Antonio to a rundown neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, an area where the buildings were crumbling and the streets were filled with the desperate and forgotten. Antonio parked in front of what appeared to be a community center, a former warehouse that had been converted into a space with tables and chairs and a small kitchen. Vittorio watched from his car as Antonio went inside carrying bags of groceries. Through the open door he could see children gathering, perhaps 20 or 30 of them, ranging in age from small toddlers to teenagers. They greeted Antonio with obvious affection, running to him, hugging him, calling out his name. For the next 3 hours, Antonio helped serve food to these children, played games with them, listened to their problems, mediated their disputes. He moved among them with easy familiarity, clearly someone they knew and trusted. When a young boy showed him a scraped knee, Antonio cleaned and bandaged it with gentle efficiency. When a teenage girl broke down crying over something, Antonio took her aside and listened while she poured out her troubles. This was not part of running an import business. This was something Antonio did on his own time, with his own resources, because he chose to help children who had nothing. Vittorio felt something crack inside his chest as he watched. This was Isabella's legacy, he realized. Somehow, despite being raised by strangers, despite never knowing his true mother, Antonio had inherited her capacity for compassion, her instinct to care for those who suffered. Vittorio left his car and walked to a nearby bar, suddenly needing something stronger than espresso. He ordered whiskey and sat at a corner table, his mind reeling. He had come to Naples expecting to find, what exactly? A version of himself, perhaps, or a man shaped by the ruthless pragmatism of the world they came from. But Antonio was neither of these things. He was something better, something purer than Vittorio had any right to hope for. The question now was what to do with this knowledge. Should he approach Antonio and shatter the peaceful life his son had built? Should he reveal the truth about Isabella's suffering, about the cruelty of the old Don, about the blood that ran through Antonio's veins? What right did he have to burden his son with the weight of the Santangelo legacy? Vittorio spent another week watching and waiting, gathering more pieces of the puzzle that was his son's life. He learned that Antonio visited his mother, Rosa Caruso, every Sunday for dinner. He learned that Antonio was well respected in the business community, known for being honest and fair, qualities that were rare in Naples' commerce. He learned that Antonio had turned down multiple offers from larger companies to buy out the Caruso import business, choosing instead to maintain his father's legacy and keep his employees working. He also learned that Antonio was curious about his origins. One evening, Vittorio followed his son to a library where Antonio spent 2 hours researching adoption records and family histories. It seemed that Giuseppe Caruso had told Antonio the truth about being adopted before he died, and Antonio had been quietly searching for information about his biological parents ever since. This changed everything. Antonio already knew he was not Giuseppe and Rosa's biological son. He was already asking questions, already seeking the truth. The revelation would not come as a complete shock, though the specifics of his origin story would certainly devastate him. Vittorio made his decision. He would approach Antonio, but carefully, gradually. He would not overwhelm his son with the full truth all at once. He would test the waters, see how Antonio responded to him, build trust, before revealing the darker aspects of their shared history. The opportunity came on a Tuesday afternoon. Vittorio had learned that Antonio liked to take his coffee at a small cafe near the import office, a quiet place where he could review paperwork and think without interruption. Vittorio arrived first, choosing a table near where Antonio usually sat and waited. Antonio appeared right on schedule, looking tired but content, carrying his leather folder and a notebook. He ordered his usual cappuccino and cornetto and settled at his preferred table. He did not notice Vittorio at first, too absorbed in whatever document he was reviewing. Vittorio waited until Antonio had finished his pastry and was leaning back in his chair, taking a moment to simply drink his coffee and watch the street. Then he stood and approached, carrying his own espresso, his heart pounding with a nervousness he had not felt in decades. "Excuse me," Vittorio said in Italian, his voice carefully modulated to sound polite but not threatening. "I apologize for the intrusion, but I could not help noticing that you are looking at import manifests. I am in a similar business, textiles from Sicily, and I wondered if I might ask your advice on navigating the Naples Port Authority." Antonio looked up, and for a moment their eyes met directly. Vittorio saw Isabella looking back at him, saw his own features reflected in his son's face, and had to force himself to breathe normally, to not reveal the storm of emotion crashing through him. "Of course," Antonio said, gesturing to the empty chair at his table. "Please sit. The Naples Port Authority can be a nightmare if you do not know the right people and the right procedures. I am happy to help if I can." Vittorio sat down, setting his espresso on the table with a hand that he willed to remain steady. "Thank you. That is very generous. My name is Vittorio, by the way. Vittorio Greco." He had chosen a common enough surname, one that would not immediately connect him to the Santangelo familia. Antonio extended his hand, and Vittorio shook it, feeling the firm grip, the calluses that spoke of a man who did not shy away from physical work. "Antonio Caruso. I run a small import business, mostly textiles and manufactured goods. How long have you been working in Naples?" "Just a few weeks. I am considering opening a small office here to handle distribution to the mainland. Sicily is wonderful, but the market is limited. Naples offers many more opportunities." They talked for nearly an hour, discussing the logistics of import business, the challenges of dealing with corrupt officials, the best shipping companies and warehouses. Antonio was generous with his knowledge, recommending contacts, warning Vittorio away from certain brokers who were known for their dishonesty. He was engaging and thoughtful, and Vittorio found himself genuinely enjoying the conversation, not just as reconnaissance, but as a connection with another person who understood the work. Finally, Antonio glanced at his watch and grimaced. "I apologize, but I need to return to my office. We have a shipment arriving this afternoon, and I need to be there to inspect it. But please, if you have more questions or need introductions to reliable contacts, stop by the office. Caruso Import and Export, just 2 blocks from here." "I appreciate that very much," Vittorio said. "Perhaps I could buy you dinner sometime as thanks for your help. I am new to the city and would welcome the company." Antonio smiled, and the expression transformed his face, made him look younger and less burdened. "I would like that. How about Friday evening? There is a small trattoria in my neighborhood that serves the best pasta alla Genovese you will ever taste. Nothing fancy, but the food is authentic. Friday would be perfect." They exchanged phone numbers, and Antonio gathered his things and left, waving as he headed back toward his office. Vittorio remained at the cafe, his hands shaking now that he was alone. He had done it. He had made contact with his son. They had shared conversation, laughter, the simple pleasure of 2 men discussing work they both understood. And Antonio had not sensed anything unusual, had not recognized the stranger across from him as his biological father. The days until Friday passed slowly. Vittorio continued his surveillance, but with a different energy now. He was no longer watching a stranger, learning about an unknown person. He was observing his son, seeing the details of Antonio's life with the eyes of someone who cared deeply about the outcome. He watched Antonio at the community center again, saw him help a young mother who was struggling to feed 3 children on her own. He saw Antonio slip money into the donation box when he thought no one was looking. He saw the way children gravitated toward him, sensing in this tall, serious man a source of safety and kindness. Vittorio also spent time thinking about what he would say, how he would gradually reveal the truth. He could not simply announce at dinner that he was Antonio's biological father. That would be cruel and overwhelming. But he could begin to build a relationship, could earn Antonio's trust, could create a foundation strong enough to bear the weight of the truth when it finally came. Friday evening arrived. Vittorio dressed carefully, choosing clothes that were nice but not too formal, wanting to appear successful but not wealthy. He arrived at the trattoria a few minutes early and was shown to a corner table. The restaurant was small and warm, filled with the smells of garlic and tomatoes and fresh bread. Other diners talked and laughed, creating a comfortable buzz of conversation. Antonio arrived exactly on time, greeting the owner by name and exchanging jokes with the waitress who brought them menus and wine. He seemed completely at ease here, in his element, surrounded by people who knew and respected him. They ordered food and wine, and the conversation flowed easily. Antonio asked about Vittorio's life in Sicily, and Vittorio found himself telling carefully edited stories about his youth, the landscape, the culture. He left out anything that would connect him to the familiar, painting himself as a simple businessman who had built modest success through hard work and persistence. In turn, Antonio spoke about growing up in Naples, about his father Giuseppe, who had taught him the import business from childhood, about his mother Rosa, who still treated him like a boy despite his age. He spoke with obvious love and respect for the people who had raised him, and Vittorio felt a complicated mix of gratitude and jealousy. Grateful that Antonio had been loved and cared for, jealous that others had been given the privilege of shaping his son's life. As they worked through their pasta and wine, the conversation turned more personal. Antonio mentioned that he had recently learned he was adopted, that Giuseppe had told him shortly before his death. "I always suspected something," Antonio said, his voice thoughtful. "I do not look like either of my parents, and there were never any baby pictures, no stories about my birth. But they loved me completely, and that was all that mattered. Still, I cannot help wondering about my biological parents, who they were, why they gave me up, whether they ever thought about me." Vittorio's throat tightened. "I am sure they thought about you every day," he said quietly. "Sometimes people make choices that seem cruel from the outside, but are driven by love and impossible circumstances. Not all abandonments are betrayals." Antonio looked at him with surprise. "That is a generous way to think about it. Most people tell me I should be angry, that I should resent whoever gave me away, but I cannot find it in myself to feel that way. My parents, Giuseppe and Rosa, they gave me everything. How can I be angry at the people who made that possible, even if they did so by walking away?" "What if they did not walk away?" Vittorio heard himself say. "What if they were forced apart? What if circumstances beyond their control took you from them?" Antonio set down his wineglass, his attention fully focused on Vittorio now. "That is an oddly specific hypothetical, Vittorio. Is there something you are not telling me?" Vittorio met his son's eyes, seeing the intelligence there, the intuition that had served Antonio well in his business and his life. This was the moment. He could retreat, could laugh it off as philosophical musing, could keep his secrets for another day, or he could begin the process of revealing the truth, trusting that the foundation they had begun to build would hold. "What if I told you," Vittorio said slowly, "that I came to Naples not primarily for business, but to find someone? Someone I had lost a very long time ago, someone I thought I would never see again." Antonio's face had gone very still. "Who are you really, Vittorio Greco? Or is that even your real name?" "My name is Vittorio, but my family name is not Greco, it is Santangelo. And I came to Naples to find my son, who was taken from his mother 30 years ago and given to a good family to raise." The color drained from Antonio's face. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. "You are saying you are my biological father?" "Yes. And my mother. She died recently. But she loved you, Antonio. She loved you with everything she had, and she spent 30 years trying to get back to you. Her name was Isabella Marino, and she was the most beautiful, the most kind, the most brave woman I have ever known." Antonio pushed back from the table, standing abruptly. His chair scraped loudly against the floor, drawing looks from other diners. "This is insane. You are insane. You cannot just appear in my life and make these claims. I can prove everything I'm telling you. I have documents, photographs, letters." "Isabella wrote you a letter, Antonio. She wrote it as she was dying, and she asked me to find you, to tell you the truth." Antonio's breath was coming fast now, his chest heaving. "Why? Why now? Why did you wait 30 years? Why did you let me grow up thinking I was abandoned? Because I did not know you existed until 3 weeks ago. Because my father, who arranged for your adoption, died 20 years ago without telling me the truth. Because your mother was imprisoned in a convent for 3 decades, held there by men who feared what her love for me might mean for their power and control." Vittorio stood slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements that might spook his son further. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope, the same envelope Isabella had sealed before she died. "This is yours," he said, holding it out. "Your mother wrote this for you. Whatever you decide about me, about whether you want me in your life, you deserve to read her words. You deserve to know that you were loved, that you were wanted, that every moment of your life has been precious to someone, even if you did not know it." Antonio stared at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake. I cannot do this. I cannot process this right now. I need to think. I need to breathe. I understand. Vittorio set the envelope on the table. When you are ready, if you ever want to know more, call me. The number I gave you is real. I will answer. And if you decide you want nothing to do with me, I will respect that too. I did not come here to disrupt your life, Antonio. I came here to honor your mother's last wish, to give you the truth she died trying to bring you. Antonio grabbed the envelope and shoved it into his pocket without looking at it. He threw money on the table for his portion of the meal, then turned and walked out of the restaurant without another word. Vittorio watched him go, feeling as if something vital had been torn from his chest. The other diners had gone quiet, watching the drama unfold. Vittorio sat back down, suddenly exhausted, and signaled the waitress for another glass of wine. He had done what he came to do. He had told Antonio the truth. Now it was up to his son to decide what to do with that truth. He finished his wine slowly, paid the bill, and walked back to his hotel through streets that had grown dark and cold. In his room, he stood at the window looking out at the city, wondering if somewhere in those lights Antonio was reading Isabella's letter, learning about the mother who had loved him from a prison cell, about the father who had searched for him too late. Vittorio did not sleep that night. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the dinner, every expression on Antonio's face. He had handled it badly, he knew. He should have waited longer, built more trust before revealing himself. But the words had come out before he could stop them, driven by the desperate need to be known, to be acknowledged, to bridge the gap of 30 years with honesty, even if it cost him his son's goodwill. All he could do now was wait and hope that when Antonio finished processing the shock, when he read Isabella's words and understood the full scope of what had been stolen from all of them, he would find it in his heart to give his biological father a chance. Not to replace Giuseppe Caruso, who by all accounts had been a good man and a loving father, but to add something new, something that had been missing all along. Somewhere in the dark city, a phone might ring, a decision might be made. A bridge might be built or a door might close forever. Vittorio could only wait, suspended between hope and despair, between the life he had lived and the life he might yet have the chance to build. 3 days passed with no word from Antonio. Vittorio remained in Naples, staying in his modest hotel room, venturing out only for meals and brief walks along the waterfront. He did not return to the cafe where he had watched his son, did not drive past the import office or the community center. He had laid his cards on the table, and now he had to give Antonio space to decide what to do with the truth. On the 4th morning, Vittorio's phone rang. The number was Antonio's. Vittorio's hand shook as he answered. "I read the letter," Antonio said without preamble. His voice was rough, strained, as if he had been crying or not sleeping. "I need to see you. There is a church near the port, Santa Maria del Carmine. Meet me there in 1 hour." "I will be there," Vittorio replied. The church was old and beautiful, its Baroque interior filled with paintings and sculptures that spoke of centuries of faith and devotion. Vittorio arrived early and sat in a pew near the back, his hands folded, his eyes fixed on the altar. He had not been a religious man for most of his life, had attended church only when the famiglia required it, when appearances needed to be maintained. But sitting here now, waiting for his son, he found himself praying to a God he barely believed in, asking for wisdom, for the right words, for a chance to make things right. Antonio appeared exactly on time, his face pale and drawn, his eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep or tears or both. He slid into the pew beside Vittorio, but did not look at him, keeping his gaze fixed straight ahead. They sat in silence for several minutes, the only sound the distant echo of footsteps as other worshippers moved through the church, the soft whisper of prayers being murmured in side chapels. Finally Antonio spoke. "I have been to see my mother, Rosa. I showed her the letter. I told her what you told me. And what did she say? She cried." Antonio's voice broke slightly. "She cried and said she was sorry, that she and my father had always planned to tell me the full truth when I was older. But the years kept passing, and it never seemed like the right time. She said she knew my biological parents were connected to powerful people, dangerous people, but she never knew the details. She and Giuseppe were told only that I was the bastard son of a familiar member who died, and that it was better for everyone if I disappeared into a normal life. Vittorio closed his eyes. That is what my father wanted everyone to believe. He wanted you hidden, safe from rivals who might use you against me, but also controlled, kept away from any claim to the Santangelo name or power. Your father sounds like he was a monster. He was. Vittorio's voice was flat, certain. He was a brilliant strategist, a powerful leader, a man who built an empire. But he was also cruel, manipulative, willing to destroy anything that threatened his control, including the happiness of his own son, including the life of an innocent woman who loved that son. Antonio finally turned to look at Vittorio, and the pain in his eyes was raw and overwhelming. The letter my mother wrote Isabella, she said she held me for 10 minutes. 10 minutes before they tore me from her arms. She said I had your eyes. She said she heard me crying as they took me away. Yes, for 30 years she lived in a prison cell, never knowing if I was alive or dead, never knowing what had become of me. And you killed her father. You are the reason she was alone, the reason she was vulnerable when your father's men came for her. Vittorio did not flinch from the accusation. Yes, I killed Marco Marino because my father ordered it, because refusing would have meant death for both Isabella and me. I was 23 years old, ambitious, foolish, desperate to prove myself worthy of leading the Famiglia. I thought I could protect Isabella by proving my loyalty to my father. I thought if I did what was asked, we could find a way to be together. But I was wrong. I underestimated my father's cruelty and overestimated my own power to control the situation. So you destroyed everything. You destroyed Isabella's life. You destroyed any chance I had to know my real mother. And for what? For power? For respect? Vittorio turned to face Antonio fully, meeting his son's angry, grieving eyes. Yes, for all those things. I have lived with that choice for 30 years. Antonio, I have lived with the knowledge that my ambition, my weakness, my failure to see what my father was capable of, cost me everything that mattered. I built an empire on the ashes of the life I should have lived. And every morning for 3 decades, I walked along the shore where Isabella and I used to meet in secret. And I tried to convince myself that I had made the right choice, that power and respect were worth the price I paid. And were they? No. Vittorio's voice broke. They were not. They were never worth it. I would trade everything I have built, every scrap of power and wealth and fear and respect, for one more day with Isabella. For 1 hour knowing that you existed, that I had a son. For the chance to have been a real father instead of the ghost I have become. Antonio looked away, his jaw working as he fought to control his emotions. I do not know what you want from me, he said finally. I do not know what I am supposed to feel. I am angry at you for what you did. I am devastated for my mother, for Isabella, for the suffering she endured. But I also feel grateful to Giuseppe and Rosa, who gave me a good life, who loved me completely. And I feel confused because sitting here next to you, I can see myself in your face. I can feel some connection that I do not understand and did not ask for. You do not owe me anything, Vittorio said quietly. I did not come here to make demands or to force myself into your life. I came because Isabella asked me to find you to give you the truth. That is done now. What happens next is entirely your choice. Do you have other children, a family? No. I was married as the Familia required, but my wife died years ago. We had no children. The old Don made sure of that, I think. He controlled who I married, when I married, made certain that there would be no heir outside his direct influence. After you, he would not risk another grandchild slipping beyond his reach. So I am your only son, your only family. Yes. Antonio stood abruptly and walked to the front of the church, standing before the altar with his hands shoved deep in his pockets. Vittorio remained in the pew, giving his son space to think, to process, to feel whatever he needed to feel. When Antonio returned, his face had hardened into a decision. I want to see where she is buried. Isabella, my mother. I want to pay my respects to the woman who loved me from a prison cell. Of course, she is buried in Sicily, in the family crypt on my estate. I can take you there. Or if you prefer, I can give you the address and you can go alone. I want you to take me. Antonio's voice was firm, If I'm going to try to understand this, to make sense of what my life has been and what it could have been, I need to see where you come from. I need to understand the world that created all of this tragedy. When would you like to go? Tomorrow. I will arrange time away from the business. My employees can manage for a few days. Then tomorrow we will go to Sicily. They left the church together, stepping out into the bright Naples sunshine. The city rushed around them, indifferent to the quiet revolution occurring between father and son. They walked to a nearby cafe and had coffee, and this time the conversation was different. Antonio asked questions about Isabella, wanting to know everything. What she looked like, how she laughed, what she cared about, how she and Vittorio had fallen in love. Vittorio answered honestly, holding nothing back. He described their secret meetings in the olive grove, the way Isabella had challenged him to be better than his father, to find another path besides violence and control. He described the last night they spent together before everything fell apart, how she had begged him not to kill her father, how he had chosen duty over love. And he described finding her coffin on the beach, the moment he pried it open and saw her face, unchanged by time, still wearing the white dress from their last night together. He described the letter, the revelation of Antonio's existence, the rage and grief and desperate need to make things right. Antonio listened to all of it, asking questions, seeking details, building a picture of the mother he had never known. And slowly, as the hours passed, Vittorio saw his son's anger begin to transform into something else. Not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps understanding, perhaps the beginning of acceptance. The next morning they drove to Sicily together. It was a long journey, first by ferry across the Strait of Messina, then by car along winding coastal roads. They talked for hours, sometimes about Isabella and the past, sometimes about Antonio's life, his work, his dreams for the future. Vittorio learned that his son wanted to expand the import business, to create opportunities for young people in Naples who had few options besides crime or poverty. Antonio wanted to be someone who built things, who helped people, who left the world better than he found it. It was so different from the path Vittorio had taken, so different from the legacy of violence and control that defined the Santangelo name. And yet, listening to his son speak with such passion and conviction, Vittorio felt a pride deeper than anything he had felt in his years as Don. They arrived at the estate in the late afternoon. Salvatore and the other men were shocked to see the Don arrive with a stranger, but Vittorio silenced their questions with a look. He led Antonio through the villa, showing him the rooms where Isabella had once visited in secret, the gardens where they had walked together dreaming of a future that would never come. Finally, they went to the family crypt, a stone structure built into the hillside overlooking the sea. Inside it was cool and dim, the air heavy with the scent of flowers and the weight of generations. Vittorio led Antonio to Isabella's tomb, the newest addition to the long line of Santangelo dead. Her name was carved into the marble, along with the dates of her birth and death. Fresh white roses filled the vases on either side, replaced daily by the villa staff on Vittorio's orders. Antonio stood before his mother's tomb for a long time, his hand resting on the cold marble. Vittorio stood back, giving his son space for a private grief, a private conversation with the woman who had loved him from afar for 3 decades. Finally, Antonio spoke, his voice echoing softly in the stone chamber. "I wish I had known you. I wish you had been able to escape sooner, to find me, to tell me yourself about who I am and where I come from. I wish so many things had been different. But I want you to know that I am okay. Giuseppe and Rosa loved me. They gave me a good life. And I am going to try to forgive Vittorio, not for his sake, but because I think that is what you would want. I think you would want us to find a way forward, to salvage something from all this loss." He turned to look at Vittorio, tears streaming down his face. "I am not ready to call you father. I do not know if I will ever be ready for that. Giuseppe was my father, in all the ways that matter. But I am willing to try to build something with you, not as father and son, but as family. As 2 people connected by blood and tragedy, and a woman who loved us both." Vittorio felt his own tears fall. The second time in his life, he had wept. "That is more than I deserve," he said. "That is more than I had any right to hope for." They left the crypt together and walked down to the beach, to the spot where Vittorio had found Isabella's coffin. The sun was setting, painting the water in shades of gold and crimson. They stood side by side, watching the waves roll in, each lost in his own thoughts. "What will you do now?" Antonio asked. "Will you stay in Sicily? Continue with the Familia?" Vittorio was silent for a long time. "I do not know," he said finally. "For 30 years the Famiglia has been my entire life, but it took everything from me, Antonio. It took Isabella, it took you, it took any chance I had at real happiness. I am tired of that life. I am tired of the violence and the control and the endless cycle of blood and revenge. So walk away. Start over. It is not that simple. The Familia does not let people walk away. I am the Don. I have responsibilities, enemies, obligations. If I simply disappear, others will move to fill the vacuum, and the violence will escalate. Good people will die, then change it from within." Antonio turned to face him. "You are the Don. You have power. Use it to transform the Familia into something different, something better. Break the cycles of violence. Find other ways to protect your people and your interests. Be the man Isabella wanted you to be, the one she believed you could become." Vittorio stared at his son, struck by the simple wisdom of the suggestion. It would not be easy. Many of the old guard would resist. There would be challenges to his authority, attempts on his life, years of struggle. But it was possible. If he was willing to fight for it, if he was willing to risk everything, he could reshape the Santangelo legacy into something that honored Isabella's memory instead of betraying it. "I will try," Vittorio said, "for Isabella, for you. I will try to be better than I have been." "Good." Antonio looked back out at the sea. "Because I am going to hold you to that. I am going to stay in contact. I am going to check on you, to see if you are keeping your promise. And if you slide back into the old ways, if you choose power over redemption, I will walk away and you will never see me again. Do you understand?" "I understand." They stood together in silence as the sun sank below the horizon and stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. Two men bound by blood and tragedy, by loss and the possibility of redemption, standing on the edge of the sea that had returned Isabella to them too late, but perhaps not too late to change the course of their lives. Over the following months, Vittorio began the slow, difficult work of transforming the Famiglia. He met with the capos and underbosses, laying out a new vision: less violence, more legitimate business, protection without extortion, influence without brutality. Many resisted. Some openly challenged his authority. But Vittorio was patient and ruthless in equal measure, removing those who refused to adapt, elevating those who shared his vision for change. It was not a complete transformation. The Familia was still what it was, still connected to the underworld, still operating in the shadows of Sicilian society. But the worst excesses were curtailed. The most brutal enforcers were retired or eliminated. The flow of blood slowed to a trickle instead of a flood. And through it all, Vittorio maintained contact with Antonio. They spoke by phone every week, sometimes about business, sometimes about life, sometimes about nothing important at all. Antonio never called him father, always used his first name, but the distance between them gradually shrank. Antonio came to Sicily 3 more times that year, always to visit Isabella's tomb, but also to walk the beach with Vittorio, to share meals, to slowly build the bridge that connected them. He told Vittorio about his work at the community center, about the children he was helping, about his dream of opening more centers throughout Naples to give young people alternatives to the life of crime that trapped so many. Vittorio listened and learned. He began to see the world through his son's eyes, to understand that real power came not from fear, but from helping people, from building rather than destroying. He started to donate money anonymously to Antonio's projects, to use his influence to protect the community centers from the gangs that might otherwise prey on them. On the first anniversary of finding Isabella's coffin, Vittorio and Antonio stood together at her tomb. They had each written letters to her, private messages that they burned in a small brazier, sending the smoke up toward whatever heaven might exist beyond the reach of the living. Vittorio's letter was long, full of apologies and promises, full of love that had survived 3 decades of separation and loss. He told Isabella about Antonio, about the good man their son had become despite everything. He told her that he was trying to change, to be worthy of her memory, to honor the love they had shared by becoming something better than what he had been. Antonio's letter was shorter but no less meaningful. He thanked Isabella for loving him, for holding him even briefly, for making sure the truth eventually found its way to him. He told her about the life he had lived, the parents who had raised him, the work he was doing to help others. And he promised to take care of Vittorio, to make sure the old man did not slip back into the darkness that had defined so much of his life. After they burned the letters, they walked down to the beach together. The morning was clear and bright, the sea calm and inviting. They stood at the spot where Isabella's coffin had washed ashore, where everything had changed. "She would be proud of you," Vittorio said quietly. "Isabella would be so proud of the man you have become." Antonio was silent for a moment, then said, "And she would be proud of you too, for trying, for changing, for choosing love over power, even this late in your life. I hope so. I hope when I finally join her, wherever she is, I will have done enough to earn her forgiveness. I think you already have." Antonio put his hand on Vittorio's shoulder, the first time he had voluntarily touched his biological father. "I think she forgave you the moment she put herself in that coffin and trusted the sea to bring her home to you. That was not an act of revenge or anger. That was an act of love." Vittorio turned to look at his son, seeing Isabella's eyes looking back at him, seeing the compassion and wisdom that she had passed on to their child. "You are right," he said. "You are absolutely right." They stood together as the sun climbed higher, warming their faces, burning away the shadows of the past. The road ahead was long and uncertain. Vittorio's transformation of the familia would take years, perhaps decades, and he might not live to see it completed. Antonio's work in Naples faced constant obstacles, constant threats from those who profited from poverty and despair. But they were not alone anymore. They had each other, bound by blood and memory, by tragedy and the possibility of redemption. They had Isabella's love, still living in their hearts, still guiding them towards something better than the darkness that had defined so much of their lives. And they had hope. Hope that even the worst mistakes could be atoned for, that even the deepest wounds could heal, that love, once given, never truly died, but lived on, in the choices and actions of those who remembered it. Vittorio Santangelo, the feared Don, who had built an empire on blood and silence, had finally learned what his father never understood. Power without love was empty. Respect without compassion was worthless. And the greatest legacy a man could leave was not fear or wealth or control, but the love he shared and the lives he touched with kindness. He had lost 30 years with his son, had lost Isabella to a prison cell and an early grave. But he had also been given a second chance, an opportunity to be part of Antonio's life, to help build something good from the wreckage of the past. And as they turned from the sea and walked back toward the villa together, father and son connected by loss and love and the hard work of forgiveness, Vittorio knew that Isabella would have approved. She would have smiled her beautiful smile and told him that it was never too late to change, never too late to choose love over power, never too late to become the man she had always believed he could be. The waves continued to crash against the shore, eternal and indifferent, carrying away the old life and bringing in the new. And somewhere beyond the horizon, beyond the reach of human sight, perhaps Isabella watched and smiled, knowing that her love had not been in vain, that her sacrifice had not been meaningless, that even in death she had managed to bring her two loves together and give them both a chance at redemption. The story that began with a coffin washed ashore ended not with revenge or blood, but with hope and healing, and the slow, patient work of building a family from the fragments of a broken past. It was not the ending anyone could have predicted, but it was the ending that mattered most. It was the ending that honored Isabella's memory and gave meaning to her suffering. It was, in its own way, a happy ending. Not perfect, not without scars or regrets, but real and earned and full of the kind of love that survives even death, even decades of separation, even the worst that humans can do to each other. And as the sun continued its journey across the sky, warming the Sicilian coast and painting the sea in shades of blue and gold, two men who had been strangers walked side by side into an uncertain but hopeful future, carrying with them the love of a woman who had refused to give up, who had trusted the sea to carry her home, who had believed that even the coldest heart could be warmed by the memory of love. The end.